I fucked up my first session of recordings for this half of the project, and, was supposed to have it all recorded by, mid-October, and instead I fucked up, and now I'm having to record this in early November, the day after the election. Fuck. Okay, quick history lesson. The Sonic series is generally broken down into different eras to make discussing the games a little easier. Obviously, this isn't unique to the Sonic franchise. It happens with a lot of game series. Mario, Kirby, Pokemon, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest. It's a pretty common technique for dividing series. However, the issue comes from where you place the dividing lines, how you split games into different eras. Basically, the only Sonic era that seems to be generally agreed on is the Classic or Genesis era, which is essentially everything before Sonic Adventure, so all the Genesis games. However, from there, it's a lot blurrier. Some people go by consoles the games are released on, or by voice actors, or even by the quality of the releases. Some people even get Sonic Boom its own era, like Sega did. For their part, Sega separated 9 of the games in Sonic Generations into the Classic, Dreamcast, and Modern era, with Heroes in Dreamcast and 06 in Modern, which feels off. The way I divide things, we have the Classic era, then the Adventure era, and then the Boost era. The Adventure era is defined primarily by multiple playstyles, in-depth stories, and an emphasis on new Anthro and human characters. See Heroes and 06. The Boost era is defined primarily by the boost mechanic, more comedic narratives, a return to classic structure, and primarily or exclusively playing as Sonic. See Colors and Generations. So what do we do with you? Sonic Unleashed, the second ever HD Sonic game, released in November 2008 for Xbox 360, PS2, and Wii, December 2008 for PS3 and Japanese Wiis, and February 2009 for PS3 and 360 in Japan, despite Japan being where the game was developed. Yeah, I don't know. It was developed by Sonic Team in Japan, with director Yoshihisa Hashimoto, the man who created the Chao Garden and technically directed FF14 A Realm Reborn. So basically a video game miracle worker. Interestingly, the game is actually titled Sonic World Adventure in Japan, though everywhere else we got a dog pun. Now, you might have noticed a couple oddities in my description there. Okay, maybe you noticed nothing but oddities, but I'm specifically talking about the platforms listed. Despite Unleashed being developed for the HD consoles, Sega decided to throw a bone to players on the 2 most successful consoles ever made, bringing a version of the title over to the Wii and PS2. In fact, this Wii release is the version of the game I grew up playing, and I definitely did play it. So, there's a bit of history to this game, and not just this version of it, but the whole thing. Development on Sonic Unleashed began sometime in 2006, utilizing an in-house engine called the Hedgehog engine, which itself began development in 2005. Yeah, apparently work started on this before 06 was released, because Sega doesn't really let its developers chill. Originally, the game was conceived of as the third entry in the Sonic Adventure subseries, though this would eventually be shelved in favor of the game's own independent identity, at least outside of Japan. Whatever, the Rush games used Adventure in their title, who really cares anymore? Apparently, Hashimoto fully expected getting criticism for the game's direction, which was accurate, but he wanted to make something that core fans could still enjoy. As part of this, and presumably because of backlash to recent entries, the decision was made to pull back on the multitude of characters previous games were juggling. Only a few returning characters and a couple new major ones, and the only playable character would be Sonic, albeit in 2 different forms. The Werehog was actually introduced as a way to introduce new players to the series, either as a draw to external gamers or to help them ease into the gameplay. Everything was going great, until they looked at the console generation's winner. The Wii is not as powerful as the 360 and PS3. More at 11. The Wii is one of the most successful video game systems ever released. It was where the new blood of gamers was, and being a Nintendo console, it was where a good portion of Sonic fans were. And meanwhile, the PS2 is still the best-selling game system ever, was still getting games released for it in 2006 and 2007, and was frankly just a smart platform to stay invested in for Sega. And these systems, while very different in a lot of ways, had very comparable power levels, to the point that the real deciding factors for which to release on were target market and waggle. But they were also drastically different from the 360 and PS3, so changes would have to be made to make the game run on them. And changes were made. The best way I can describe it is, You know, back when licensed kids games would come out for every console under the sun, including handheld versions that were completely different from the console version? Well, basically, Sonic Unleashed was like that, except the handheld version was also on home consoles. They even got the handheld Sonic developers Dimps to work on it. Not the last time Dimps would make a pared-down version of a Sonic game, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The game released in 2008, and the response was mixed. Critics ended up fairly split, with the daytime Hedgehog gameplay generally ending up praised while the nighttime Werehog gameplay was panned. The different versions also got vastly different receptions. IGN gave the HD versions a 4.5 out of 10 and the Wii version a 7.2, while GameSpot gave the Wii version a 7 out of 10 and the HD versions a 3.5. As for the fanbase, similarly mixed. Hardcore fans were initially extremely against the game, especially the Werehog and the new character of Chip. However, over time and as the series has gone different places, I've actually seen the fanbase's opinions start to shift. Some people still very much hate it, of course, but over time, a lot more people have come around to enjoying the game. Hell, I've even heard some people say it's their favorite Sonic game. Well, okay, one YouTuber. So, I guess we should see if I'll make the count too, huh? First things first, though, this isn't the version I'm going to be playing. Love the Wii, but no. The SD version is basically an entirely different game with major gameplay changes, level design differences, incredibly different gimmicks. It's all a lot. Even the story is drastically different. Yeah, most of the cutscenes were ported over, but the plot in the SD version, oh, I don't even know where to start. If you know what the words Gaia Temple Guardians means, you may be entitled to financial compensation. So instead, we're looking at the HD version, and hey, unlike 06, this game is actually available on the PS3's digital storefront. And I mean, I already bought a PS3 specifically for this project, so logically I can use it to play Unleashed as well. I mean, sure, the PS3 version apparently doesn't run as smoothly, and the 360 version is backwards compatible with the Xbox One and Series systems, with the Series consoles in particular giving the game a technical boost that would arguably make that version the best possible way to play the game. But come on, it's not that important, and I've already bought one console for this project. It's not like I need to, you already know what the punchline to this is. I bought a fucking Series X. To be fair, now I can play Elden Ring and Starfield without choking my PC's storage limit, so not a complete waste of money. Let's talk presentation. Well, the game looks fucking gorgeous, as I would expect, given I paid over $500 to play it in this form. What did I do this to myself? But yeah, it looks good. The game's big claim to fame is the environments, realistic and colorful locations which you can stop and admire or blast through in seconds. And you know what? It is honestly really impressive. Obviously, the Series X version runs better than the original with a smoother frame rate and shorter loading screens. However, personally, I think what the game does is impressive even on the original consoles. And it's not just the performance or environments either. The game just looks great. The new enemies all feel very natural for this world, with Eggman's robots being more grounded than the Egg Robos without going fully off genre like in 06, and the Dark Gaia monsters being a lot more in line with the Anthro characters than the literal hellspawn of either the Black Arms or Iblis's minions. And speaking of more in line with the Anthro characters, human NPCs return, and they don't look like they're from an entirely different universe from the main characters. Huzzah! It is possible! Granted, I'm not 100% sure some of these aren't kind of racial caricatures, but it's a world adventure, they had to differentiate NPCs between countries somehow. Besides, I'm a Zelda fan, I don't have a leg to stand on in terms of questionable race shit. Speaking of looking incredibly good, we need to talk about these cutscenes because, holy shit. The in-engine cutscenes, they're fine. They're more cartoony than previous games, which may not be to your personal taste, but I kinda appreciate it personally. Plus, I mean, I honestly think these in-engine cutscenes look better than the pre-rendered cutscenes of either adventure game or even Sonic Heroes. But the real standouts are the pre-rendered cutscenes, animated by one Marza Animation Planet, and oh my god, holy shit, have you seen these cutscenes? It's been said before and I'll say it again. If we got a full animated film in the style of Unleashed pre-rendered cutscenes, it would be the best video game movie ever made. Easily. Honestly, as someone who's played most, if not all, of the 3D games past this point, I'm pretty comfortable saying these pre-rendered cutscenes are the best Sonic cutscenes we've ever gotten, hands down. But again, the pre-rendered cutscenes have already thoroughly gotten their days in the spotlight, so let's move on to the game's sound instead. Well, the voice acting is good to great. I really enjoyed Jason Griffith's performance as Sonic here. He apparently did a lot of vocal training after recording 06, and it really shows here. He does an amazing job. Impressive given he was apparently suffering from strep throat during the recording sessions. Amy Pollant and Lisa Ortiz also put in great performances for Tails and Amy respectively, and Mike Pollock once again kills it as Eggman. As for the new characters introduced in Unleashed, Chip is honestly kind of charming if you can put up with Anthony Salerno's kind of cartoony performance. Plus, the 4Kids VA for Knuckles made it in even without Knuckles appearing, and he gives a decent performance for Professor Pickles. Overall, it's a good set of performances all around, which I'm glad about. I mean, it is the team's last main entry as the characters. I'm glad they got to show off. You ever think about the fact we've had at least 3 major voice actors for Sonic in English, but in Japan the same VA has been doing the role since Adventure? Wild. As for the music, I mean, it's great, yeah. Sort of more like Sonic Heroes than, say, the Adventure games. We do have a couple vocal tracks in the end credits, most notably Endless Possibility, a jam performed by Bowling for Soup frontman and replacement Chuck E. Cheese, Jarrett Reddick. And there are some standout level themes like Cool Edge's Day music, which somehow manages to fit perfectly with the snow-themed level while also being an independently awesome track. Overall, though, while all the music fits for the region it's in, it's not exactly an OST I'd want to play at all times. Besides, the song most people are going to remember after playing is... yeah. Truly, the decision to have one piece of music that plays anytime the Werehog is in combat in a mode that is primarily a beat-em-up. Truly fascinating. Alright, we've got the boring technical stuff out of the way, let's talk writing. I mean, I spent almost half of my last review talking about 06's writing, surely I have just as much to say here, right? Honestly, not really. The plot starts with Sonic raiding Eggman's space fleet, presumably at the end of an off-screen implied adventure, given he already has all 7 Chaos Emeralds, but Eggman tricks him into standing on a very specific spot in an orbital space station with a laser designed to fire directly at the Earth and... wait a minute. Didn't they already do this in A New Hope? Well, regardless, Eggman steals the Chaos Emerald straight out of Super Sonic, somehow, and fires a laser directly at the planet, cracking it apart and sending the 7 continental shelves outwards into orbit. I'd question the physics of this, but considering we're about to be introduced to a literal god, I feel the realism is kind of pointless. This destruction awakens Dark Gaia, that told you, who begins trying to wreak havoc before dissolving into a gas and scattering across the planet. Oh, and Sonic is even more of a furry now, somehow. Then Eggman sucks him and the decharged emeralds out into space. Oh, now the vacuum of space actually exists. Sonic falls down to the planet below, landing on a small, chinchilla? Fairy? Chihuahua squirrel? Well, whatever he is, he now has amnesia, possibly because Sonic landed directly on him after falling from space, so Sonic agrees to help him regain his memory somehow. To do this, they travel into town, where Sonic names the weird thing Chip, he eats ice cream and somehow gains an infinite supply of chocolate bars, and when night comes, Sonic realizes he's now a werewolf. Werehog. Technically, given the etymology, shouldn't it be Hogwolf? Or does that sound too much like a racist transphobe wrote him? Soon they find Tails, who takes them to meet a colleague of his known as Professor Pickles, and they begin trying to put the planet back together. Along the way, they meet up with Amy Rose, who mistakes Sonic for Sonic before realizing he's Sonic, develop a camera that can spook the ghosts out of people at night, find temples that can turn into Chaos Emeralds colorful again, and try to not be killed by any of the giant animal demons or Eggman mechs. Oh, and maybe complete 1 or 2 side quests, if they feel like it. Maybe help an American businessman become a surrogate father figure for an Italian girl, or help a kid from Jordan become a famous singer in New York. You don't have to, of course, it's always optional. The side quests, that is, not meeting Amy, the sexual harassment is mandatory. The whole plot would fall apart without it. I actually think the writing in this game is pretty solid. It's definitely on the looser, more cartoony side of things. Sonic even breaks the 4th wall in the first in-engine cutscene. And Chip is just a well of cartoon stock sound effects, which I guess might explain why he was received like he was Scrappy-Doo. But the plot is actually fairly intriguing. The side stories you can find are pretty interesting, and I think the character work for most of the leads is pretty effective. Tails' cowardice aside, I guess. So, yeah, overall, pretty good writing. Definite step up from, say, the last 3 games. But, of course, what matters in a video game is the gameplay. That's why it isn't just a film. Like Marza would make later. In Unleashed, we have 2 distinct gameplay styles, Hedgehog and Werehog, or in other terms, daytime and nighttime. During the day, Sonic is his usual self, and we get the grand introduction of the boost system, kinda sorta. It's technically called ring energy in this game, plus boosting has kind of appeared before, but this is where it became the kill enemies and collect rings to continuously hold the boost button and run in a straight line in 3D that we all know and know. Though, interestingly enough, the level design isn't as linear as you might think from later entries. In fact, even with the occasional switches between 2D and 3D, this is a much more open experience than I was expecting. Different routes, shortcuts all over the place, and even collectibles to incentivize exploration. But if you just want to speed through, you pretty much always can, with there usually being at least one path of least resistance where you can just hold the boost button and pray for the best. Well, keyword being usually. There are some times where the game throws up certain obstacles. The biggest annoyance during the Hedgehog levels is that, quite honestly, Sonic might be a little bit too fast. There are ways to mitigate that, thankfully. We have a level up system for boosting speed and a ton of Werehog stuff I'll get into in a little while. So you can just choose to never level up speed and keep it at an extremely low level. It still feels breakneck though, and more than a little hard to control. Yes, as usual, when we get into moments where precision is called for, the character advertised as the fastest thing alive isn't entirely perfect. Though there have been changes and additions to try and make things easier. For one, there's a reticle that lets you know what you're targeting with the homing attack. How is that not in earlier games? Other than secret rings, I guess. You also don't lose every ring you've collected whenever you get hit. The cards on the table, I don't know the exact rules the rings do work by. The manual just says attacks will, however, cause you to drop some of your rings, and I genuinely can't find any sort of explanation for how many you lose per hit. There may be some calculation of damage based on attacks, like in the night stages, but if so, it's entirely hidden from view. Of course, it's entirely possible I'm just missing something. Sonic Retro says you lose half if you have 40 or more, but I'm like 90% sure that's bullshit. Again, fan wikis are helpful, but not completely reliable. There are also a few brand new features introduced to make the game control better, ostensibly. The most useful is probably the quick step, which lets you quickly move left or right without having to turn around, useful for the straight running sections, and something I'm very glad has stuck around in later entries. We also have an unlockable stomp and wall jump, because like I said in 06, late 2000s Sonic had palpable Mario envy, and trust me, that will come up again. But the big addition, and one of the only additions that would ever end up scrapped, is the drift. And boy do I get why this wasn't in Forces. Don't get me wrong, I understand what they were going for here. It lets you turn sharper corners and fills a bit of your boost gauge, but it is so tricky to actually use properly, and I swear half the time it doesn't even work. The move was reworked in Colors and Generations, was completely scrapped in Forces, and appears in exactly one stage of Frontiers as a level gimmick. And Lord above, I do not mind its death. We also have the Lightspeed Dash here, once again locked behind a power-up, though thankfully it now has its own dedicated button, like it should. The slides improved a fair amount, we can crouch and crawl if that's still too tricky, and we even have the foot sweep from 06 returning if you really needed that. I do think it's odd that the homing attack is now mapped to the boost button instead of hitting jump twice, but otherwise, yeah, the Hedgehog plays pretty well. So, let's see the double furry. Surprisingly enough, the Werehog gives us a gameplay style we haven't seen yet from the series. It's a beat-em-up mode, complete with combos and a health meter. We don't even lose rings if we get hit, unlike the Adventure 2 mechs, so if you can make it through a night level without losing a life, you can build up a ton of rings. Not that collecting a ton of rings is necessarily beneficial to any significant degree, but it does feel cool. Being a 3D beat-em-up, the Werehog gameplay is much more focused on combat, exploration, and a few unique platforming and movement mechanics. We have a double jump, can grab onto ledges, bars, poles, and whatever the things you grab onto and jump in one of 4 directions are called, and you can even pick things up. Water barrels, keystones, people. But of course, even with the platforming sections, which are okay, the main name of the game is combat, so how does it feel to fight as a Werehog? Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it's very easy to just end up button mashing through most of the combat encounters in the game, especially early on. There are some very cool combos, don't get me wrong. If you want to get really good at the Werehog, you absolutely can, like some of these attacks are pretty precise. But also it's pretty viable to just brute force your way through any major obstacle prior to the ending, especially if you spend your experience points wisely. Like the Hedgehog form, the Werehog has stats you can upgrade using EXP. You get EXP from Chaos Orbs. Chaos? Where? Which spawn from enemies when you defeat them, and given the combat focus of the Werehog, you'll obviously get a ton from the night levels, and by extension, the Werehog has a ton more to spend the EXP on. 5 different stats, 10 upgrades for 4 of them, and a whopping 30 levels to unlock brand new combo moves. Yeah, if you want to 100% everything in the game, you're probably going to be grinding out EXP for the rest of the year, if not your whole life. To be fair though, they do have an effect on things. You can get more HP, shields block certain attacks, how much damage you do with your attacks, and of course, get more time for Unleashed mode. What, was he restrained up until now? Unleashed mode honestly isn't anything too crazy. You get temporary invincibility, at least in this version of the game, you move and hit faster, and you deal double damage. It's pretty useful, you charge it up with energy that dead enemies and destructible objects drop, good to use against mini-bosses, but otherwise not much to talk about. There's also some very light puzzle solving as the Werehog, but otherwise that's... What? The platforming? It's, you know... Look, can we not do this? I want this to be less than an hour. Well, questionable platforming aside, that's the core gameplay, and I'm gonna be honest, I really think this all works. Yeah, it's not perfect, the drift isn't great, and the platforming isn't amazing, but honestly, I really do like most of this. Yes, even the Werehog. I can definitely understand preferring the Hedgehog gameplay to the Werehog, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't kind of prefer it myself, but I do think the Werehog gameplay still works. Keep in mind, as much as Sonic fans bitch and moan about how the developers need to focus on Sonic and Sonic alone, as far back as Sonic 3, we've had multiple player characters with different controls and different gameplay. And honestly, I think the slower, more exploration and combat-focused Werehog works really well as a counterpoint to the high-speed, platforming, and boosting-focused Hedgehog. I'm not going to be upset with anyone who doesn't like the Werehog gameplay. These things are admittedly very subjective, but personally, I really do like it. But of course, the core controls and second-to-second gameplay is only part of the gameplay equation. So, what kind of levels are we playing? What's our side content? And how's the level progression work? Well, we actually have a degree of non-linearity for the first time, ever. Yeah, design concept Mario's been messing with since '88, and Sonic only got to it 20 years later. Go figure. Yeah, we actually have a degree of choice in what order we complete certain levels, in addition to new requirements for how to access individual acts. We have 8 main hub areas all around the world, each with at least a couple levels labeled acts. Each requires a certain level of medal collection, requiring the player collects these sun and moon medallions that are sprinkled across every level in Hub World. See, that's how you use collectible medals. Although admittedly trying to grab them in the day levels can be kind of a pain. It's not a crazy amount of freedom, of course. While there are optional acts, the required levels tend to be unlocked in groups of 2 or 3, and you have to complete the full group before you can unlock the next batch. Make no mistake, there is still an order to how you're supposed to do things, even if it isn't as strict and in your face as Sonic 06 just making level portals disappear and locking the doors to the other hubs. But hey, at least now we have actually interesting and diverse hub areas. They're all a lot smaller and simpler than, say, Soliana, but to make up for that, they're filled with unique named NPCs who all have actual personalities and don't fall in the Uncanny Valley. Plus, each hub is themed after a real-world location. Abydos is Greece, Alaska is Alaska, Missouri is, frankly, just the whole Western conception of Africa, but more specifically Mali. We even have Empire City, based on San Francisco. Wait, no, I think I misread that, sorry. Okay, it's actually based on New Jersey. The NPCs actually deserve a bit of focus here, since they're the ones that give most of the side content here. For one, after clearing a certain stage, you get a camera that can spook Dark Guy as minions out of certain possessed humans at night. This starts a short beat-em-up Werehog segment in the town, which can get you some extra EXP. Not much reward outside of that, though exercising certain NPCs unlocks new missions to take on, and those missions are interesting. So there are a ton of missions you can take on for the NPCs at Unleashed, and there's a lot of variety in those missions, like an absurd amount. Some involve answering questions given by the NPC or just talking to another character or getting them a specific item that you can either buy at a shop or find hidden near the level entrances. But others actually involve going into levels and completing various tasks, mostly pre-existing levels with new objectives and slightly altered design, which is pretty smart design. And here's the thing. A lot of the time, the reward for completing these missions is either unlocking another mission you have to find for yourself somewhere in the world, or just flat out nothing. Like, at least in 06, you got rings you could use at the shop to unlock new abilities. Here, even if you got rings, which you don't, all you can buy are food items for a little extra EXP, a few collectibles to admire in the professor's lab, and some random concept art, songs, and cutscenes. And the few rewards missions do get you are those same concept art pieces, songs, and cutscenes. Or if you clear a mission from a hot dog vendor, a slightly more powerful food. So in theory, the missions are completely useless to actually play. And yet... Yeah, I actually did a ton of missions during my playthrough. Part of it was the same instinct that made me do most of the missions in Sonic 06, but I also really did enjoy these missions. It's mostly because, unlike 06, this game is actually fun to control, so it actually feels satisfying to do these optional side quests, running around levels or hub areas, trying to find NPCs with tasks for you to do. I'm not going to act like these are some masterpiece of game design. There probably should be more rewards for these than just the satisfaction that a random CG character is now slightly happier, and some of the missions do kind of feel like busy work gameplay-wise. But hey, they're also all completely optional, so yeah, I like the missions in this game personally. Then again, I am legitimately mentally ill. Again, I've used the Professor Layton games as a coping mechanism. My gaming opinions are not universal. One last note before we get into the level design. I like the entrance stages. They're technically parts of the hub areas, but unlike those in other overworlds, they're actually built similarly to the actual levels. It's not the biggest thing in the world, but it's a nice touch that I appreciate, especially as someone who grew up with the vastly inferior Gaia gates. So let's talk the levels, the most important part of most Sonic games. Are we sure I can't talk about the plot a bit more? I can discuss the ending. Look, I don't dislike this game's level design, I really don't. I mean, realistically, the only reason the core gameplay works so well is that the levels are well built around it. Windmill Isle, Savannah Citadel, Skyscraper Scamper, Rooftop Run, these are well-built, well-designed levels. They also kind of just bounce off my brain like I covered it in repulsion gel. That's a joke from my Portal-loving Sonic fans who watch small YouTube channels. It's basically just Dan. Hi, Dan! I really don't get why I have such a hard time remembering a lot of these levels. It might partially be because of the non-linear structure I mentioned before. If you're constantly bouncing between locations to play through each act, it's hard for any one level to leave a huge impression on you, and when it does leave a memorable impression, it's usually for the wrong reason. Like the nearly uncontrollable bobsled of Cool Edge Day, or the bullshit platforming sequences of Dragon Road Night, or the stupid fire wizards in one pointless room of infinite enemies from Arid Sands Night, or constantly getting turned around and confused during the water running sequence in Jungle Joyride Day. And then of course there's the final level of Eggman Land, which is, to be fair, extremely cool thematically and very appropriate as grand finale. It also took me almost an hour to beat, has some very iffy platforming moments, and has a mini-boss arena at the very end with 2 copies of the hardest enemy in the game alongside infinitely respawning wizards, where I almost got a game over, which would have forced me to play through the whole thing again, and wow, would you look at that, the Sonic ending curse strikes again. Yep, I'm giving it a name now. Though frankly, Death Egg Syndrome would probably be a lot catchier. And it sucks that the most memorable moments I had with these levels is when they frustrated me, because on the whole, I really do like them. They're all thematically brilliant, sticking to the national theme of their associated city beautifully. World adventure indeed. Like, these are genuinely a great set of levels, but my god, I'm very glad I'm writing these reviews right after playing the game, because I guarantee by the time this video actually comes out, the only set pieces I'll remember are the moments where I almost snapped my controller in half. And Series X controllers aren't cheap, I really don't want to have to get a replacement this soon. There are also the gimmicks that the game throws at you, specifically with the QuickTime events. These pop up mostly when hitting certain dash ramps and when performing finishing moves as the Werehog, and they're really not worthwhile additions to the gameplay. It doesn't help that there's a full mini-game that pops up twice built entirely around the QTEs. Yeah, I wasn't a fan of Sky Chase, but at least it was more involved than Tornado Defense. Boy, really hitting a sour note with the game, huh? I mean, I can't exactly say I'm surprised given its reputation, but still. Okay, just so we can end the basic gameplay discussion on a high note, the boss fights in this game are actually pretty decent. Yes, some of them do rely on QuickTime events, which is a bit cheap, but in general I think they work really well with the overall gameplay of the Hedgehog and the Werehog. The Hedgehog bosses all mostly focus on the boost mechanic, trying to catch up to Eggman's mech so you can pop them with a homing attack. The Werehog bosses, meanwhile, are built around the beat-em-up gameplay, having you wail on the bosses, throw objects at them to make them vulnerable. One even has you moving blocks to take chunks of its health bar off. It's all pretty smartly designed, and honestly, I really appreciate it. The final boss fight too, that's a real doozy. Dark Gaia's first phase is pretty tricky, trying to get around the flaming rocks and block the giant laser, but I do appreciate the sheer scale and intensity of it, plus how we have fully integrated platforming sequences as Sonic built into the fight. And the final showdown with Perfect Dark Gaia blasting around in all 3 dimensions as Super Sonic for the first time since Adventure 2, dashing into the weak points of its shield, finally taking it down alongside our game-wide companion. Oh, it's all so good. Well, that's all the base game covered, or at least most of it, but I do have one more thing I need to discuss, namely the DLC. Yes, Sonic Unleashed has downloadable content in the form of level packs. We have brand new acts for the 8 main countries in the game, as well as hard mode reworkings of most of the base game levels, which is really cool. The new acts are also pretty damn brutal in and of themselves, though. Honestly, that's kind of the thing with most of the optional acts in this game. I didn't end up playing most of them because the ones I did play seemed pretty unfair and unbalanced. I cleared a couple, so I can say there is value to these level packs, but honestly, unless you're looking for even more challenging content from the game, I wouldn't really recommend it. Maybe buy one if you want to test it out for yourself, but buying all 6 packs might be a bit much. And that was Sonic Unleashed, and my thoughts overall are... I don't know. Sonic Unleashed is a very interesting game to go back to for so many reasons. As I alluded to in the very beginning, this is very much a transitional entry in the series, acting as kind of a bridge between the Adventure era and the Boost era. And in a lot of ways, that kind of makes it the awkward middle child of the series. It gets a lot of positives from both styles, but also a lot of negatives. Still, I think on the whole, the positives do kinda outweigh the negatives, and as much as I joked about it, I can absolutely understand why someone would call this their favorite Sonic game. I personally wouldn't go that far, even ignoring later entries. Compared to the current highlights of the series, I feel like Adventure 2 has a lot more memorable high points and engaging moments, and 3 and Knuckles is just all around more consistently high quality across the board. But still, for what this game is, I think Sonic Unleashed really is worth a look. Definitely want to play if you haven't already. At least on the HD consoles, I didn't play the Wii version again. I made that mistake with Ocarina and Majora, not again. So yeah, solid recommendation here. If you have a Series X or S, and I realize it's not a ton of you, definitely worth giving it a try. I think you can technically play it on PS4 and PS5 as well via PlayStation Now, but honestly I would sooner recommend picking up an Xbox One than get a game streaming service for one game. Or of course you could pick up an original PS3 or 360 and get to play both Unleashed and 06, exactly one of which would be worthwhile. But I swear, I'm not buying another console for this project, okay? Whatever game comes next, I'm playing on something I already own. Assuming they still have 4 on Steam.